gentlemen, it's my job to try and persuade you, together with my colleague, Dr. Ha-Joon Chang, of the truth of this proposition that there is too much maths and too little history in economics as it's currently taught and conceived. Well, let's start off with an obvious question. Why do people study economics? Basically to understand how economies work. And there are two different ways of understanding that. I mean, there's maths and there's history, and they stand at opposite poles in terms of epistemology. Let's take maths first. First, two things that maths tries to do, claims to do. First of all, it's concerned with propositions that are necessarily true. That is, it's a branch of logic. But secondly, maths is concerned with propositions that can be proved. And economists really endorse maths in the second sense, that is, for generating provable propositions. But because the social system to which they apply maths is so complex, too complex to obtain reliable proofs, they're tempted by the first, or what I would call the Platonic view of the subject. And throughout the history of economics, one can find economists praising maths as the pathway to rigorous and elegant laws, akin, as one famous economist said, akin to the laws of celestial mechanics. And this powerful temptation, Platonic temptation, was very well summarized by Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman when he wrote this after the crash of 2008-2009. The economics profession went astray because economists, as a group, mistook beauty clad in impressive-sounding mathematics for truth. Economists fell in love with the old idealized vision of an economy in which rational individuals interact in perfect markets, this time gussied up with fancy mathematics. It's an old vision, gussied up with fancy maths. And this insidious drift towards Platonism explains something it's particularly, you can find it in the work of Bob Lucas, explains something which a number of people have noticed, and that is the strong normative thrust of mathematical economics. Now, an economic model is not like that like a model of an aeroplane, that is reality in a miniaturized form. It approaches reality by way of assumptions. An assumption is said to be chosen for its purchase on reality, but in fact, more usually, assumptions are selected because of their convenience, typically to make possible the solution of an equation by excluding extraneous elements. But these acts of exclusion are choices, one's always got to remember that, which define the problem of interest or direct the inquiry along certain paths. That is, they reflect the values of the economist. As soon as you get into an assumption-based mathematical modeling, you are actually inserting the problems you think are important and also inserting your view on how they ought to be discussed and excluding other views on how they ought to be discussed. And this exclusionism, together with the virtual impossibility of proving anything, gives mathematical economics a powerful incentive to make the real world more like their models than to make the models more like the real world. So there's one very, very important bias in mathematical economics. What then is the role of history in economics? I would argue that the role of history is that of a reality check. Propositions from financial theory, such as risks are correctly priced on average, could not survive any actual knowledge of financial market, the way financial markets work, or of economic history. The branches of history especially suited for reality checks are economic history, the history of economic thought, and political and social history. All are excluded or minimized in the standard economics curriculum. They have been largely pushed out by mathematical economics. The general reason for the exclusion of history is quite insidious. It arises from the belief that everything to be learnt from history has already been incorporated into the latest textbooks, and this ludicrous belief has taken a heavy toll on the study of economics thought. It arises, I think, from what I call physics envy, an affliction to which many economists are prone. Economics wants to be a hard science. If economics is like a natural science, the lessons of history have already been incorporated in the latest models, and no useful purpose is thereby served by recalling the history of mistakes. To quote J.B. Say, famous for something known as Say's law, and this was already true in the early 19th century, he wrote, "What useful purpose can be served by the study of absurd opinions and doctrines that have long since been exploded and deserve to be? It is mere useless pedantry to attempt to revive them. The more perfect a science becomes, the shorter becomes its history. Our duty with regard to errors is not to revive them, but simply to forget them." So much for the history of economic thought. And contemporary courses in economics have taken Say's dictum to heart and made it their business to exclude past errors. And that's why you don't actually have any study, really, of economic thought in most economic curriculum today, because they would be the study of mistakes. And we've transcended those mistakes, haven't we? That's why we never have any crashes. Now, but the point of studying history of economic thought is precisely to realize that the important debates in economics have never been resolved and continue to vex us today. Is the quantity theory of money true? Is it true that state spending is inherently wasteful? Economists have always been divided on such issues, and the different contemporary schools are heirs to these disputes. To sanitize them by delivering a mainstream textbook account or opinion is to rob the subject of its richness, diversity, and ability to illuminate reality. Knowledge of the history of economic thought can help us avoid hubris or absolute confidence in our own favoured school of thought, be it neoclassical or post-Keynesians. And so economists shouldn't aim for a comprehensive, universal and timeless theory, but must try to keep up with and understand a continually changing system. Studying history makes it clear that the truth of economic propositions depends on the context in which they are applicable. For example, can anyone doubt that the Keynesian revolution arose out of the circumstances of the Great Depression? Can anyone doubt that Friedman's monetarism was a reaction to the inflation of the 1970s? To take a less obvious example, and this I think is controversial, the marginalist revolution of the 1870s was part of an attempt to refute Marx's labour theory of value. The notion that the factors of production are paid their marginal products was a very useful affirmation of the value of the businessman to society. Economists try to get some historical hinterland into their understanding of the economy, but by copious use of statistics and econometrics. But as Robert Solow rightly points out, in an article very well worth reading, all narrowly economic activity is embedded in a web of social institutions, customs, beliefs, and attitudes. Concrete outcomes are undoubtedly affected by these background factors, some of which change slowly and gradually, others erratically. As soon as a time series gets long enough to offer hope of discriminating among different hypotheses, the likelihood that they remain stationary dwindles away and the noise level gets correspondingly high. Under these circumstances, a little cleverness and persistence can get you almost any result you want. Finally, history shows us how economic ideas reflect power structures. Can one reasonably doubt that financial theory reflects the interests of the banking system in freeing itself from state regulation? So let me end with a final thought. Progress in economics is not from the particular to the general. I think that's a big mistake. We don't start with partial and incomplete theories which evolve through a process of maths to ever more general theories which contain progressively more of the truth about economic life. That's the model of a natural science. That is not how economics works. It's never been true of economics. I would like to champion the view of horses for courses, for choosing those bits of economics appropriate to different problems and situations without any presumption that one approach is superior to others. For example, development economics requires relatively little maths because the real problem has to do with government and governance. On the other hand, if you want to forecast the conditions of supply and demand for a particular product or a particular sector of the economy, then maths is very helpful and useful and indeed essential. So there's a sort of there is a case for mathematical microeconomics. In fact, it's very important. But having said that, the banishing of history from standard economics curricula is a symptom of a loss of pluralism and imagination in the discipline. It's become complacent. It's become archaic in many of its intellectual structures. Students now leave universities thinking there's only one way to do economics, the way they've been taught in years 1, 2, and 3. And this lack of diversity leads to intellectual arrogance. Economists treat anyone who doesn't do economics in their way as somehow inferior. They may be politely condescending, but the condescension is undoubtedly there, and I expect the condescension to be polite this evening. Awareness of the past should make our discipline less arrogant and more useful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lord Skidelsky. I now call upon Professor Caselli, who will not be in the least bit condescending, I'm sure.
Hello. All right, so I don't know if there is too much math in economics. Maybe there is too much, maybe there is too little. I think as a starting point, I think maybe the most useful thing I can do is to try to tell you what math is for me as an economist and how I use it, because I use it, and why I use it. So what do I do? Well, it usually starts, or actually not usually, always starts with observations. Okay, you always are on the lookout for facts that are perhaps a little puzzling, a little difficult to understand, hopefully important to understand. Stuff happens. And I think economists are here, if the stuff that has to do with economics, are here to explain why it happened. Okay? In fact, actually, economics, in many ways, is history, because it's about looking at something that happened, Maybe it's just an event that has been described by other historians or by even journalists. Or maybe it's in the data, and there is some data that tells you, look, there is a fact out there. And then, as many historians do, you look at this thing and try to interpret it, understand it, to tell a narrative, to tell a story for what happened in that particular case. And it almost never starts with math. Almost never. It starts with an intuition. It starts with a hunch. It starts with some kind of story you tell yourself in your mind. And you tell it yourself with words. Okay? You tell it with yourself with words. You say, this is an interesting fact that just happened there. Or maybe happened 200 years ago, for that matter. It doesn't matter. How can I explain it? Maybe you say, well, here is a possible story. A, there was fact A, that fact A caused fact B then caused fact C. You tell yourself a narrative. Okay? Now, what happens when you tell yourself narrative? So this is building a theory. Okay? Now, building a theory doesn't mean to use math. Okay? You can build verbal theories. Sociologists have theories. Historians have theories. Every time you explain something, that's a theory. You're making a theory. But one thing that I think any theory should have, whether it's verbally expressed or whether expressed with math, it should be logically consistent. It should hang together. You should not miss things. You should not draw the wrong conclusions. You should not be led astray. So why is math useful for me? Because what I do is I first tell myself the story in words, and then I retell the story. Try to retell the same story in math. And why is that useful? Because sometimes, if you really want to know why that's useful, it's useful because I'm not smart enough. Okay? I'm not smart enough to just verbally think about all the things I might be missing in my argument. But if I missed something, the math will tell me. The math will ring a bell and says, look, you are not getting what you were expecting. So you're missing. Your story was too simplistic. You missed something. Okay? Let me try to give maybe a flavor. This is a bit risky, but let me try to give you a little flavor of how that might work. Okay? Now, this is a bit difficult because I think many of you, I don't know how many of you are econ majors or have taken my course, for example, in the first year. So I need to come up with something that is accessible to people who haven't taken even first year economics. So it's going to be something very simple. Let's say that, Steve here, my colleague Steve, is a labor economist. He worries about what happens to labor supply when wages go up, will change. Okay? Will workers want to work more when the wages goes up than they were before the wage went up? So if I approach this question in a very verbal, simple way, I think I'm going to come up with something very clever, which is this. Wages went up, well, workers should be willing to work more. Okay? The reward for working is up, so they should be working more. And I might be tempted to run with it. I might be tempted to say, well, that makes sense, I'm going to run with it. Now, if I force myself to also write the same story in math, I will immediately realize that I'm missing a big chunk of the story, which is, as wages are higher, of course, as you probably, all those of you who are in economics already know, as wages are higher, people also can afford to consume more leisure. And so actually, the effect of wages increases on labor supply could be an increase or a. But I think you can see how I might have gotten too excited by my wages goes up, so labor supply goes up, and stop there. If I force myself to retell the story in math, I'm going to catch that mistake. So that's one way I use math. I use it as a thinking tool. I use it to catch mistakes in my reasoning. Now, let me be very clear. And this is where the point about you almost never start with the math is important. If I just found that my simple intuition was wrong, just because the math said so, and then I went to my colleagues and said, well, the math says it's this, I get kicked out of the room. I need to go back and understand, again, in words, what the math is telling me. Okay, why was I wrong? What did I miss? And if it's just the math telling that, and there is no intuition, there is no reasoning, there is no way of rationalizing verbally what you have found with the math, then that's not good economics. Okay, so it's a double narrative. There are two narratives reinforcing each other. There is a verbal narrative and there is a mathematical narrative. The mathematical narrative keeps you on your toes, but the verbal narrative ultimately is most important. Which is why, when we teach economics, I mean, those of you who took my course, you know I don't use any math. I believe that I can teach most of what's important in economics without any math. But I wouldn't necessarily have believed it if I hadn't checked the reasoning with math before. But then, once I've checked it, I can rely on the verbal version of it and just go with it. So that's one way I use math, as a thinking tool. Now, there is another way of using math, which I think is more and more important, especially in my field, with much macroeconomics, which I think is becoming more and more important because it works very well with computers. And that is precisely to do what one of the proponents of the proposition just told you that you cannot do with math, which is to deal with complexity. I think it's completely the contrary. I think math is a wonderful tool that allows us to deal with things that even people smarter than me cannot deal with because they're too complex. Okay, so think about macroeconomics. Macroeconomics, there is some shock that occurs, maybe the government is doing austerity, the central banks is changing interest rates, and that affects the behavior of literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of different agents, consumers, firms, other branches of governments, foreign agents. And the way these people respond to the changes in the economy will then trigger further responses from the other guy. So there are then second-round responses. The responses of firms affect the responses of consumers. The responses of consumers affect the responses of government. The responses of government affect the responses of firms. I don't know anyone who's smart enough to maybe Keynes was, but since then, I don't think there have been many people who are smart enough to kind of trace this incredibly complex web of reactions and counter-reactions. But if you think you have reasonable, and this is a big if, but that's not what we're talking about here, we're talking about math. If you think you have a reasonable description of how agents process information and act on that information, then you can use a mathematical formulation or representation of this, put it in a computer, and have create again a narrative of the responses to the economy. So that's the other of the two uses of math. So this is why math is important to me. This is why math is a critical tool in my toolkit. It's not the only one, it's not the main one. First of all, as I say, there is always thinking through it. But without the math, I would be like a plumber who has been taken away one tool, one of the many tools that he uses day to day. Let me make a couple of sort of kind of impromptu responses to what we just heard. Perhaps the biggest misconception that I think there is about economics, and it's not so much about math. And actually, let me first make a more general point. I think there is a lot of confusion between math and other potential shortcomings of economics. Okay? And if this debate was about some other potential shortcomings of economics, I might probably be on the side of those who criticize economics. So, for example, and this thing already came up, very often the discussion of whether there is too much math in economics gets mixed up with a discussion about whether the assumptions of economics are right or wrong, are realistic or unrealistic, or whether they should change over time. If that was a debate, I would be much more sympathetic, for example. I think there are huge problems in economics about the assumptions we make. For example, the assumptions about extreme forms of rationality that agents have, or the extreme forms about the information capacity of agents have. But that has nothing to do with math. You can have the wrong assumptions and be completely verbal, and you still get junk at the end. Okay? and you can have the wrong assumptions and be mathematical and get junk at the end. You can have the right assumptions and be verbal and get it right. You can have the right assumptions and be mathematical and get it right. It's very important to me that we separate the debate about whether the assumptions of economics are right. I think in many cases they are not. And the discussion of the methodology of mathematics, which is completely separate. Two more points. Another huge misconception about economics. This idea, which I don't know where it's coming from, that there is this just one overarching model and that we are all slave to this one model and we try to fit everything into that model. It's just not true. It's just not true.
Krugman, by the way.
I don't need to share Krugman's opinion about economics. I don't think Krugman has been in a seminar room for many years. It's just not true. Again, go back to my initial example. You observe something and you tell yourself a story. Okay? You're not going to try to squeeze this into some, big brother kind of Platonic model that is out there. No, you're going to try to write something that is essential and that try to get at that particular question. And so I completely agree with Skidelsky. You should have a different approach. The model, the story that you tell is going to be targeted, tailored to the particular questions you're asking. And that's what we do all the time. History, I have very little to say about that. I think there is an enormous amount of history in economics. There is an enormous amount. Let me just give you one very small piece of information, but it's not dispositive, but I think it gives you a sense. In the economics department, we give every year, actually no, not every, we started this year, but from now on it's going to be every year, a prize to the two best PhD theses, okay, to the two best PhD theses of that year. So we have theses on the Great Recession, of course. We have theses on development in villages in Bangladesh today. We have theses on labor markets today. We have all sorts of stuff focusing on the present. The two winners of this year's prize wrote theses on, respectively. One was a thesis about the consequences of the Napoleonic blockade on the development of the cotton industry in France. This person won the thesis for the best prize for the best PhD thesis in the economics department this year. The other winner won a prize for the consequences of the introduction of the telegraph between Europe and North America at the end of the 19th century. These are the two people we, the economists, the history-blind economists, have given prizes to this year in the department. Of course, we knew that there was this debate coming up. We're dealing with data all the time. We are constantly looking at data. And I think that's one way of making history, of looking at history. The data tells us histories, and our job is to try to understand them. So I think we are historians more than anything else.
I now call upon Professor Ha-Joon Chang to present for the proposition, please.
Right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you, the organizers, for organizing this wonderful event. Let me start with this. According to Dr. Sheldon Cooper, the greatest scientist of our time, well, after Stephen Hawking, according to him at least, from Big Bang Theory, in unraveling the mysteries of the universe, we need three things: math, science, and history. Huh? It's there. Huh? Note that there is no economics there. Huh? Well, of course, there are people who think history is a rather boring thing, studying which is rather useless. And in this movie, based on Alan Bennett's brilliant play, The History Boys, there's a character called Raj. It's this boy, played by young Russell Tovey, who is asked by his history teacher to define history. And he gives a most succinct answer that many people might agree with, and it's just one fucking thing after another. Well, indeed, these days, many economists are... what happened here? Yeah. Slideshow, where is the slideshow? Yeah. Of course, these days, many economists consider the study of history to be a rather low-grade intellectual pursuit on a par with train spotting, bird watching, and collecting Pokemon cards. No, seriously, I mean, it's beginning to slowly change, but let's face it, I mean, there is this perverse intellectual hierarchy in our profession in which the less... this is not moving. No.
You need to scroll.
Scroll. Okay, so let's leave it at that. Yeah. No, this is a perverse intellectual hierarchy in which the less what you do is related to the real world, somehow the intellectually more superior you are. Huh? So if you're the cleverest, you do mathematical modeling of something that has very little to do with the real world, like, I don't know, Turing machine. Huh? No, don't get me wrong. I mean, these things have to be done, you know. I'm not one of those people who deny that these things are useful, but somehow these people are thought to be superior to other people. And if you're not that clever, you, become econometrician, but then never running regressions, but econometric theoretician. So ideally, you should have a PhD in statistical theory. If you're not that good, then you do macro. If you're not even that good, you become a development economist like I am. And if you are not even that good, then you become economic historian. Yeah? And if you are running around surveying factory managers, trying to understand how firms organize their production, there must be something wrong with you. No, this kind of intellectual hierarchy unfortunately exists in other fields, Many of you have watched the Big Bang Theory. Yeah? There's a clear hierarchy. Theoretical physicists, experimental physicists, that's Sheldon and Leonard. Yeah? And then Howard, he only went to MIT and did engineering. Yeah? So he's like the scum. Yeah? So I'm not saying that economists are unique in this, but somehow we have developed this thinking that somehow abstract theories, mathematical modeling, that's useful, but I would argue that economists need to study history, they need to understand history, and they need to draw lessons from history. And I can think of at least 5 reasons for that. Well, first, very obvious but important point, history is where the present has come from. So without understanding the past well, we can understand the present well. Yeah? It's a very obvious proposition, but people often forget that. Yeah? Second, what people know about history, or rather what they think they know about history, affects the present and by implication the future by informing people's decisions, including how they, for example, build their models when they're economists. So despite the pretense that economists do not need to know anything about history in order to make the right policy recommendations, a lot of actually policy recommendations are backed up by historical examples. So free trade economies have the biggest the guns in their arsenal. Yeah? Britain and the United States became world economic superpower because they practiced free trade. Yeah? Well, there's nothing like spectacular real-life cases, successful or otherwise, in persuading the others of the wisdom of your policy recommendations. Yeah? So if you want to recommend anti-inflationary policy, you talk about Weimar Germany and Zimbabwe, yeah? Instead of, say, South Korea in the 1960s and 70s, where inflation rate was nearly 20%, but the economy grew fantastically. Yeah? So that people actually use these selective examples, and unfortunately, that this is very widespread. I cannot go into that, but basically, I have written quite a few books where, yeah, this is a commercial break. Where I show that this shouldn't be here, but I put it there by mistake. No, that has come later, I've written these things to show that this sort of official versions of British or the US history are very incorrect. And if they knew that Britain was the most protectionist country in the world in the late 18th, early 19th century, if they knew that the US was the most protected economy for 120 years since the 1830s, the promoters of free trade, whether they are economic theorists or policymakers, may not have such conviction in their policy themselves and would have harder time in persuading the others. Thirdly, I think the history is very useful in letting us question some taken for granted assumptions. Once again, if I tell you this, many of you will say, yeah, I knew that, but, this was never integrated into your kind of economics education. So, I'm still going to put it to you, lots of things that cannot be bought and sold today, human beings, labor service of children, government offices, used to be perfectly marketable. On the other hand, there are things that could not be sold 100 years ago, even 50 years ago, but they are sold center, left, and right today. A lot of countries didn't have patents until the late 19th century. Financial derivatives became what they are today only because in 1982, two of the financial regulatory bodies in the United States agreed that you can actually financial derivative contract based on unreal things like inflation rate or weather or things like that. Things that cannot be delivered. So that created a whole new set of financial products. And once you know these things, you will realize that the boundary of the free market into which political logic shouldn't penetrate is actually not drawn by some timeless law of science. It's drawn by political and ethical decisions. Another example, if you learned that the advanced capitalist economies grew the fastest in history between the 1950s and the 70s, the so-called golden age of capitalism, when there were a lot of and increasing regulations and high taxes, you will question today's accepted wisdom that the best way to generate growth is to cut taxes and red tapes. The United States in the 1940s and 50s had two communist presidents. Maybe you haven't realized that. They were called Harry Truman and Dwight Eisenhower. Under them, the top income tax rate was 92%. Despite that, the US economy grew at 2.5% during the golden age. In the last 3 decades of neoliberal experiment, it has grown at 1.5%. These are all in per capita terms. So once you know that, you will think, differently of all these underlying assumptions. Fourth, history is useful in making you see the limits of economic theory. As I like to say, life is often stranger than fiction. And history has given us so many successful economic experiences at all levels, nations, companies, individuals, that cannot be explained very well by any single economic theory. I mean, Robert already talked about many different schools of economics, and in that book, the User's Guide, I tried to explain that there are at least 9. Oh God, this is useless. Yeah. At least 9 different schools of economics, and they all have their strengths and weaknesses. And it's because they were all developed in order to solve particular problems. They are based on different political assumptions about human nature, assumptions about ethics, and so on. And they are good at different things. Yeah? So to illustrate that, I give you the Singapore problem. You know, when you read about Singapore in, the newspapers or standard books on globalization, we'll only hear about its free trade policy and its welcoming attitude towards foreign investors, which it has. But you will never be told that 90% of land in Singapore is owned by the government, 85% of housing is provided by government-owned housing corporation. They have a forced savings scheme, and a staggering 22% of GDP is produced by state-owned enterprises, including the famous Singapore Airlines. So I often put it to my graduate students, give me one economic theory, it doesn't matter what it is, neoclassical, Keynesian, institutionalist, Schumpeterian, one economic theory that can single-handedly explain Singapore, and I dare say that there's nothing like that. Yeah? So you need to know that these different theories, different historical experiences. You know, even just to look at the data, I think we need to learn a lot about history. You know, let me give you a beautiful example. I mean, all this openness and growth regressions. Yeah? So you measure some countries' openness by looking at, say, the effective rates of protection or some indicator of openness. But unless you actually know something about the countries that you put in this regression, you can make a big mistake. For example, in South Korea, between the 1960s and 1980s, there was a very rigorous foreign exchange rationing by the government, which made tariff rates almost meaningless. Yeah? The tariff rate could be anything. The government can refuse to sell you foreign exchanges because the government owned all the banks. Yeah? So if you know something about Korea, you would be immediately skeptical about using tariff figures to measure openness. Yeah? I mean, I said that because I happen to know a lot about Korea, but what about other countries? Yeah? You know, if you look at other countries, probably there are 50, 70 countries where tariff rates are not that meaningless, meaningful. Yeah? So even just to use data in intelligent way, you need to know some details about history. Yeah? And last but not least, we need to look at history because we have the moral duty to minimize live experiments with people. Yeah? No, this is a serious point. Yeah? I mean, economists have killed actually a lot of people. Yeah, from central planning in the Soviet Union, the Big Bang transition back to capitalism, austerity policies following the Great Depression, structural adjustment programs in the developing world. I mean, they have ruined many people's lives. Yeah? I mean, of course, learning history doesn't make you repeat the mistakes. Yeah? It doesn't make you avoid repeating those mistakes, but it reduces its chances. So we need to learn history out of moral duty. Yeah, yeah, so that's the summary, but let me spend the last minute or two to talk about the more practical side of the argument, because you know, a lot of economists say, yeah, I mean, the history is useful, but then when it comes to actually assigning hours to different parts of the curriculum, they say, well, however, there's so much math to teach, let's forget history, let's drop it. Yeah. Some of them even say, well, you know, history people can teach themselves. Yeah, they can read books. Yeah. But we have to teach them math. Yeah? Well, I think this is quite problematic because unless you put your money to your words, so to speak, you are not really being serious about it. Yeah? Now, if you say that, I recognize history is important, but we have no time to teach history, then you are just giving lip service. Yeah? So that if you really think history is serious, you have to teach this. Yeah? Teach this in a systematic way. Yeah? Because that history, somehow we have developed this idea that if some things are written in words, it's easier to understand. No, it's not like that. Yeah? History requires a particular type of reasoning and understanding and empirical skills. And for that purpose, I think that this needs to be properly taught. And unless it's in the curriculum, you cannot expect students to study it. Yeah? Let's face it, that your generation is already suffering from having to do 65 internships before you can even apply for a job. Yeah? You haven't got time. Yeah? So unless this becomes an important part of the curriculum, I think that you may want to study economic history or history of economic thought, but you won't be able to. Yeah? So let's leave it at that. Thank you.
Very much, Mr. Chang. Now we have the other point of view from John Stephen.
Not doing too well here. I'm definitely not going to be as funny as Ha-Joon Chang. I liked some of the jokes and I liked lots of the snippets from the proponents. But lo and behold, when I was listening to you guys, I really didn't hear you talking about the field I'm working in and the academic discipline that's around me. Ha-Joon was talking about a hierarchy of fields within economics with the more mathematical, like mathematical economics and econometrics on top and development economics towards the bottom. So I brought this graph which has the Clark Medal winners by decade. The Clark Medal is a medal given by the American Economic Association. Used to be every 2 years, now it's every year, to what the profession in the US thinks is the best economist under the age of 40. So it's a pretty selective prize, actually more selective than the Nobel. And the blue ones were theorists, the yellow ones were people who were working with data, empirical people, the green ones are sort of empirical methodology. I didn't know exactly where to put them. We could, of course, argue how to classify particular individuals. But you can see in the last 5 years, in the 2010s, no single mathematical modeler has won the Clark Medal. In fact, one of the winners was a development economist at Esther Duflo. And you'd have to go back quite a bit before you find somebody actually, extremely mathematical. When I did this graph, I thought the math and the theory in economics used to be much more important. And I'm actually somewhat surprised that even among the early winners, a lot of them were very involved with looking at data and looking at evidence. This graph is another bit of evidence going along the same lines, that actually, if anything, theory, I think, in economics peaked around the 1980s. These are publications in what most of us consider the 3 top journals to publish in economics, and this is a classification of papers into theory and papers that look at data, the red ones versus the blue ones. So in the 1980s, about 2/3 of the best economics done or best economics that got published was theory, and now that's down to 1/3, and 2/3 is empirical work. So in general, it seems to me that economics has gotten quite a bit away from just doing modeling and turned a lot towards looking at evidence and thinking about it. A lot of the empirical work that's being done these days is actually not particularly mathematical or even particularly based on models, but having some theory in the back of our minds, and I think everybody actually agrees with that, is sort of necessary in order to interpret the data as well and think about them. So the one point is that I think there's more empirical work and less theory in economics than you might think. I think the quality of the empirical work has also gone up, and empirical economics has actually delivered some important insights. I want to give you just a couple examples. One is a study by Marianne Bertrand and Sendel Mulanathan. What they did is they mailed fake resumes to actual job adverts. And what they did is on the resumes were identical for the different jobs, but on some of the resumes they put names that were very white sounding, and on others they put names that were very black sounding. That's easy to do in the US because there's a big cultural divide between the races. On the white resumes, they got about callbacks for 10% of the resumes they send out. For the blacks, they got only 6% of callbacks. So blacks need to send 50% more resumes before they get the same number of interviews. This work has been extremely influential. It's been widely replicated in other countries, in somewhat different settings, with different ethnic groups, with men versus women, and so forth. And in many instances has thrown up pretty convincing evidence that there's some discrimination in the job market. Now, you might have heard that very recently the Prime Minister announced that UCAS is actually going to remove names from university applications, and this is based on this research. Another aspect about this study that's interesting is that the methodology was not something these economists thought up by themselves. This idea of sort of sending two identical people who might look different, to buy a car or rent an apartment or get a mortgage or apply for a job, that was actually thought up by sociologists, and economists have learned it from them and then, done their own wrinkles on this. The second example I want to give you is research on the minimum wage. There's been a lot of studies, particularly in the 1990s, on the effect of minimum wages and whether minimum wages destroy jobs. And lo and behold, a lot of that literature showed that either there are no employment losses or the employment losses are relatively small. Now, there's a big debate between those who find zero and those who find small, but lo and behold, the effects are small. And for policymakers, the differences that were found are probably not that important. Again, these studies have been fairly influential in policy, and probably the UK national minimum wage in 2000 was instituted partly because of these types of findings. Now, no employment effect of the minimum wage goes against the most standard model of a competitive labor market. If you have a downward sloping labor demand curve, you would think that raising the minimum wage destroys some jobs. But certainly the theories we have are flexible enough to accommodate either a zero finding or even employment increases as well. You just need some frictions in the labor market where workers actually search for jobs. So, it's not that these findings are refuting existing models necessarily. Having the models in mind is useful because they do caution us that despite these findings are in circumstances where the minimum wages are fairly moderate, like in the US and the UK. That doesn't mean that you can raise the minimum wage to £15 or £20 and necessarily expect the same benign effects. So, to me, really, a lot of economics is fairly applied, fairly in tune what's going on in the world, policy relevant, and that doesn't sort of seem to chime with the description that we hear from the critics of the discipline. So, if economics is not doing so badly, why is the image of economics so bad? I think the reason for that is that the teaching is not nearly as good as the research.
What?
I think the teaching is concentrated too much on the math. There's too little empirical context and too little applications of what we're doing and too little effort to teach you to actually make use of the tools that we have at our
side, are you?
You know, my conclusion is basically, I agree with you guys. There should be There should be fewer models. There should be less math. Now, I would say on the margin, not wholesale. You know, I don't think we should throw out all the math and all the models. I think in the way that Francesco has described them, they're actually quite useful. I would like there to be some more history in economics and in the economics curriculum. I'd be fairly open to this. I think we should interact more with other social scientists. I don't see anything wrong with that. On the other hand, I'm skeptical that all of this is sort of going to lead to some grand transformation of economics, and all of a sudden it's going to be this wonderful, very different animal. At the end of the day, we're social science. We're dealing with complex social interactions, and it's just very difficult questions. There are no easy answers, and I doubt that just by having more interactions, I think it's fruitful, but I don't think it's going to be revolutionary and all of a sudden economics is going to turn into something great and very different. I don't quite see that happening. Even now, I think economics is a pretty broad church. It's not just some free market, free traders who all want small government. There's the whole range from Joe Stiglitz to Danny Kahneman to Bob Lucas with very different views and very different ideas of what to do within the current framework of economics. So that's it for me.
I would like to follow up on the point, what I regard as the critical point made in that presentation, that there is a difference between the undergraduate curriculum and what economists do for research. It seems to me that this distinction is worth discussing in more detail, and I imagine there are some people on the floor who have strong views about that. But could I just ask the other panel members who about whether they think a distinction between applying this proposition to the undergraduate curriculum has more validity than applying it to economic research or advancement of knowledge. Any offers?
I think there is certainly that problem. I mean, what is taught in the classrooms is quite behind what's happening on the academic front. But I think, if you think that only marginal adjustment, like introducing a little bit of this, little bit of that, would help. I think that we have a problem because I think that the problem with the current undergraduate teaching program is, unfortunately, it has been designed on the assumption that the students are mostly likely to go on to graduate studies. But let's face it, 90% of you are going to go out in the real world, work in the private sector, work in international organizations, work in NGOs, work in the think tanks. And for that, I think the curriculum is just too kind of abstract and not related enough to the real world. And I think that is a serious point that we need to confront. It's no good pointing out that, Duflo did this, Acemoglu did that, if what you see that in the classroom is rather abstract, duality theorem and lots of math, and students need time to learn other stuff.
Yeah, could I just reinforce that? When I was at Warwick, I spent a number of years marking MSc theses, and they were all formulaic, really. You start with an intuition of some kind. You then introduce the model in a mathematical form, and then you test it in some way or other. Usually end up inconclusive, but you've shown you can do what's required, and those are sort of things that certify you as competent. Now, whether you do anything after that that's any good, it doesn't matter. But that's the sort of the next stage up, having done one's undergraduate course and gone into that. And I would also, say one thing that I don't recognise. I think the opposition drew a distinction between mathematics as modelling and the use of maths for empirical work. I don't see that. I don't see that is quite right, because what I think members of our side were arguing was that a lot of empirical work is it doesn't consist of a time series or comparative series. It is using history in a non-mathematical way to tell us something about what happened before. And I think the attempt to confine everything within the envelope of mathematical technique of one sort or another, whether it's modelling technique or statistical technique, is exactly where the subject goes wrong, because it's too exclusively reliant on it. That would be the point that I would make.
On this last point, I couldn't disagree more. The wealth of knowledge that empirical work, by which I mean cross-sectional panel data, perhaps a slightly less time series, but even time series has yielded is just extraordinary. And I think Steve gave two very clear examples of that, where we have used the economists have used the econometrics to tell us things that are of first-order importance about the world in which we live, and I think econometrics is the right way to go for many of these questions, and we are blessed to have this tool, and it would be catastrophic if we lost it.
Yeah, well, we agree with that. Is it the only way to go? You seem to equate empirical with statistical.
I think I've expressed my respect for history.
Have you?
Absolutely.
I think so.
What history have you found worthy of respect?
Can we? I think we want to have a little order here. I would like to see if we can elicit some opinions from or positions from the floor. We've got a short time, so someone here. Can we get the microphone down to this rather central position?
Hello. Yeah. So one of the issues that I find with Professor Skidelsky's argument is really the centrality of economics towards policy making, And by policy making, I'm defining it as something which is technical, right? So consider the problem of the central banker who wants to decide to raise interest rates, right? There you need, don't you think we need some kind of a framework to tell us, for example, how much the interest rate should be raised or reduced? History can tell us whether or not we should do this at all. You know, whether the Fed should raise interest rates right now is a question that history should analyze in detail. But without rigorous econometric models of some sort or the other, without some kind of theoretical framework to back us up, how much does the Fed raise the interest rate when it has to make this decision? And what kind of basis would we give to such a question?
Are you asking me specifically or the panel?
The entire side that thinks math should be thrown out if, you know, not.
Well, of course, you have to have a theory of what the impact of changing interest rates is. But that has been disputed. It is, you've got to know something about, some people argue that interest rate policy is actually relatively ineffective at doing either in its effect on prices or in its effect on the real economy. That has been a dispute going on. Now, it seemed to have been resolved in some way in the 2000s when the whole of macro policy was really interest rate policy. And certain things happened, and that was a signal to raise your interest rate, to raise bank rate, others to lower them. It turned out that was actually not adequate, it was incomplete, and now, since the recession, the arguments have started again. You've got a zero bound, now what do? Now, the point is you've got to know something about those disputes. Then you come to a judgment. Of course, data are very important, and that includes quantifiable data as well. But then pure economic history and knowledge of the history of economic thought is absolutely essential for a central banker to come to a judgment. And in fact, sensible central bankers who are not slaves to dead economists actually find that they do use their judgment.
I think that's a very interesting example of how the statistical work and historical work have come together. The response in the U.S. to the Great Recession in particular was led by a man who has written mathematical models, estimated statistical relations, and being a scholar of the history of the Great Depression. And we were very lucky to have that guy.
And he was wrong. You're talking of Bernard Bernanke. Yeah. He was. There's another story to be told about the Great Depression. Why did narrow money increase during the Great Depression? The whole thing is subject to dispute. If you know nothing about the disputes, but only know about Bernanke and Friedman and that line to an explanation, you're likely to be quite, make some serious mistakes as a central banker.
You think the U.S. has dealt badly? Monetary policy in the U.S. has been the inappropriate one during the Great Depression?
Can I see if we get somebody else in on the conversation?
You prefer the ECB policy?
No, that's worse.
Hi, I'm Huang from Rethinking Economics Network. I'm not going to comment about mathematics in academic economics, as I'm not an academic myself, but I want to comment about what I was taught as a student. And as an academics graduate, I can only summarize my 3 years of undergraduate economics education as too much useless math and too little, if any, history. I am not anti-math myself, as I'm sure none of us here is. I enjoy math a lot. But I am against the excessive reliance on one particular tool to explain the whole economy. When can we students stop learning only about constraint optimization, which by the way, is 19th century mathematics, and start learning some other useful tools to understand the open, complex, adaptive system we call the economy? Where is psychology, with politics, history, sociology, and of course, also some real 21st century mathematics, why we at it?
I think that's a statement rather than a question.
Thank you. I wanted to react to a comment made by Professor Caselli and trying to differentiate between two debates, the one on the assumptions in economics and the one on the use of mathematics. But I think they're very much linked in a way that history of economic thought can teach us that the constraint by thinking quantitatively and wanting to do mathematical modeling in economics constrain the assumptions that can be used. If economists are so fond of rational expectations, it's because they're very convenient in modeling. The same way as if we assume selfish interest, it's because it allows us to have closed models. And so the same would go with some assumption of having rational behavior with some bias. It's still a simplistic view of human behavior that is very useful when you want to think in terms of equations and closed models.
Can I just say, before rational expectations, even in mathematical model, we had adaptive expectations, which are much, much easier to deal with. So, that was a movement towards complication. And by the way, I don't necessarily think that was an improvement in terms of the plausibility of the assumption. So, and I think there are different ways. So for example, critics of economics like a lot now something called agent-based modeling, which is basically a mathematical model with no optimization. Okay, that's cuts away completely all the optimization part. So that's much easier actually. That's much easier than having optimizing agents. So I think the statements that the assumptions are driven by mathematical convenience is just not right. In fact, abandoning adaptive expectation was a movement towards more difficult math, more difficult models. Using model with optimization instead of something like agent-based models is more difficult.
Thank you. Could I have another contribution from the floor, please? Person right at the back.
Yeah, hi. My question has to do with whether, if, say, we do introduce greater theoretical pluralism into the study of economics, and if we do study more history during economics, that it will probably change what the graduate economists know. And when they try to enter into the labor market, what their employers expect them to know. Now, given that I would guess that employers really like the mathematical approach because it's easier to be implemented into a model, and in turn it's easier to sell to customers in financial markets. You can create a model, you can predict things in theory at least. So what do you think that, how is economics going to compensate in terms of getting money into the study if we introduce more history, and thus we kind of decrease the mathematical sophistication of economics graduates?
Yeah, can I respond to that? Well, first of all, if that one problem with this country is that most employers are in the financial sector, so they are working at something more prone to quantification. But if you are working in the car manufacturer or other types of companies, that kind of mathematics might be less useful. I mean, you will need maths for engineering, but not for the financial management. But more importantly, if they really want good mathematicians, why would they hire economists? No, because there are real mathematicians, there are physicists, there are engineers, and then we economists are like number 4, So we are 4th best mathematicians. Yeah? They don't necessarily want maths from us, because if they really want maths, they can hire real mathematicians. Yeah? So economists need to learn other things in order to compete with those people. And I think that real-world employers actually find people with broader education. You know, I'm in Cambridge also involved with Center of Development Studies, and I mean, we produce PhDs in development studies, which is interdisciplinary study, and those people have no problem in getting jobs in the private sector, in the World Bank, in the United Nations, because actually they know a bit more about the real world than your standard economists, and I think that can be a strength. So this curriculum change, yeah, it might need a kind of adjustment period because the employers are going to say, wow, these guys are different. Are they necessarily better, more useful? But then after a while, I think they'll be persuaded.
Thank you.
The lady?
Yeah, the lady.
Yeah.
Coming your way.
Thanks. Judith Shapiro, LSE. I'd like to pick up on something Robert Skidelsky said. That is, development economics needs little maths because the problem is governance. And that is exactly why I could not possibly support that side. I'd like your reactions to that, despite the fact that we've had agreement across the panel that we don't want 20th century economics, we want 21st century economics, and we want to bring it into the classroom, the seminar room, and the lecture room. And it's not just because they're colleagues of mine and I have to see them tomorrow and they're the best teachers we have at LSE. It's because I believe that Ha-Joon Chang has been tirelessly arguing, and very well, and not using econometrics, for the causality flowing the other way. That's how I understand his work. And it was relentless and it made an impression on me. I'm not necessarily going to apply it to Africa. I'd like to see an argument about that. But he said, the evidence is the causality goes the other way. Today's rich countries acquired most of the institutions that today's dominant view, that's Robert Skidelsky's, considers to be prerequisites. I also don't know what there is about governance. We need to unwrap that, which is what I think some of the random control trials try to do. Is it political democracy? Because Singapore doesn't have political competition, but it doesn't have corruption on the other hand. Is corruption important? And that's where I think the kind of econometrics that Steve Pisckhe's books talk about and that is practiced is one of our ways forward. And I also then finally want to get your reaction on this question of not going from the particular to the general, because we haven't got very far with the general. So it would be very nice to see some of the particular where we drill down and find out, for example, one of the things that Francesco Caselli works on, the natural resource curse. What happens there? Not just is it a curse, but why? And I don't think we can do that without econometrics, but of course you need smart econometrics, you need arguments. The internet, which Ha-Joon Chang thinks is less important than the washing machine.
I stand by this statement.
Yes, okay. Let's have a debate about it, you and I, sometime. Okay, I shouldn't have got into that. Let me finish, because I want other people to do it, with that idea that I can't trust you with my curriculum, because I think you want, both of you, economics by assertion, and by the way, I don't think your assertions would then win. And I think evidence is very important, and not just models, but we need to test them. We'll never get a right answer, but at least we'll have a debate that's based on evidence, not on who has the toughest convictions, which, by the way, is one of the reasons we have 5 males up on the platform. Thanks.
I mean, emphatic statements based on false either-or propositions will always win support in a political argument. That was a political speech. And it didn't really, I mean, it was great. I mean, I enjoyed it very much, but I don't think it really addressed the issues. No one's against evidence, and no one is against using whatever tools you have available to get evidence to support your propositions. I mean, no one is against that. So, I mean, to say that we're against it. What I think I was saying when I made that statement about development economics not needing as much maths as some other branches of economics was that the problem, which many development economists have identified is the problem of governance. And that is not something you can necessarily deal with or resolve just by lots of data. You just can't do it. I mean, these are problems of political theory, these are problems of institutions, how they work, and the context of those institutions. They're examples. They're examples of the incentives facing particular rulers, and so on. So, I mean, I'm saying you just need a broad array of evidence in order to come to a conclusion. Is that so controversial? Is that a reason for saying, we can't possibly support you because you have said you need more than one tool? That's the question I put to you. And that's not, I didn't intend that to be a political speech.
May I just quickly add one point to that? Well, I think what counts as evidence depends on your theory. So it's not totally independent from theory. So, I was once listening to a debate on radio on the alternative medicine, and this the standard kind of medical person was insisting that we need RCT to show that something works. And this the acupuncturist, he was a British guy, pointed out that, well, actually in acupuncture there's no point in body where you can stick a random the pin and have no effect. Every point has effect. So there's no kind of acupuncture equivalent to placebo. So if you have that kind of philosophy, then the RCT doesn't necessarily establish evidence. So, well, what I'm saying is that basically you need different layers of evidence. Yes, you need cross-section econometrics. You might need time series. You might need panel data. But then you need historiography. You need the anthropological approach. You need surveys, you need structured interviews, all these things need to work together to create that robust evidence. Unfortunately, we are these days saying, unless it's econometrics or RCT, it's not evidence. I find that very problematic.
Ha-Joon, can you explain to me, how do the other methods resolve the acupuncture problem?
No. That was just an illustration, but I already gave an example.
It was a bad illustration.
No.
How do your methods solve it?
No, that was an illustration of how your theoretical position actually affects what you count as valid evidence. Yeah. So that was
you can stick a needle anywhere and it does something, then it's very hard to figure out what acupuncture does.
But sorry, can't you have some guys you don't stick a needle in, and then the guys who stick a needle in?
No, but their bodies are different, that's the problem, yeah? No, but more seriously, these other evidence are necessary. I already gave you an example about Korea having this foreign exchange rationing by the government, which makes the tariff rate meaningless, yeah? So unless you know about how these different countries work, you don't understand, there were people in the 1980s running regressions trying to show that the share of spending on industrial subsidies as a proportion of GDP had negative or positive effect on the industrial performance. Yeah? Unfortunately, what they didn't understand was that in countries like Japan, industrial policy was not mainly conducted through subsidies as it was in Europe. Yeah? So if you don't know that evidence, you will treat Japan exactly as same as European countries, which creates a problem. Yeah? So you need those other knowledge to conduct intelligent econometrics investigation.
But that's just saying better done academic work is better than poorly done work. That we can
all
No,
but what is better?
That's good.
I mean, yeah.
There's a question on the end here.
Probably because of this reference to the acupuncturist. But I got sort of interested on this distinction between the particular and the general, and I cannot help but remembering either the work of Karl Popper or Bertrand Russell, and that's the story of the inductivist Turkey. So I want to ask Professor Caselli, because I think that after all, this is a kind of false dilemma, history and economics. I think that there is something prior to that, and it's the empirics of it. And you mentioned, you started your presentation talking about history is like, well, stuff, or the empirics, the stuff happens. Is the data given? Is you consider that the way to economist or social scientist would take the empirics or the data as given? Is that what you suggested?
Yeah, I mean, the way I think about it is a journey that starts with data and ends with data. You start out with the observations, which are often...
No, I understood that. My question is if data is given or if it's a historical construct, or if it is part and parcel of the epistemic of it. And that's the story of the inductivist Turkey or the failed acupuncturist. Do we start from the observation? Is that observation exogenous, completely external to us?
Right.
Or is historically determined? And that is a problem with economic history, because we cannot witness the data. We have to work with data that is given to us.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The question was to me, so I'll try to... I mean, look, there are... we could spend hours and hours discussing all the things that are wrong with the data that we have. And then we can also spend many hours thinking about whether the things that are wrong about the data are wrong by design or they're wrong by accident. I mean, just I don't have the patience to sort of my hunch is that I'm a macroeconomist, so a lot of the data I work with is national accounts data. My hunch is that the national accountants do the best they can with enormous amount of problems, and they don't get it perfect. But I think there is information in the data they give us.
If I may, I'm not going to go to the 1990 Gary Chemist dollars, but I will ask you then, why is that the case that all economics papers end up predicting, I mean, the results are as predicted, and there is usually no attempt to bias or falsify the model or the hypothesis?
That's just not the case. I mean, that's not it. I mean, you mean empirical paper? You mean empirical papers?
Quickly.
Yeah. That's not the case. I mean, there are lots of negative results. There are a lot of people who say the
point
coefficient is zero.
Get in. I mean, I think this illustrates a sort of point of important difference. You say economics starts with data and ends with data. I say it starts with theory and ends with theory. And none of the economic theories we are familiar with came out as a result of direct observation at all. They just didn't. It was, and a very good example is adaptive expectations ends with rational expectations. I mean, it's one theory contesting another theory, and the whole debate takes place within the world of theory. And observation had very, very little to do with that particular transition.
It is my sad duty to wind up the debate. I want to call upon both sides to offer a very succinct summary of key points before we take a vote on it. So,
I'd like take my short time to rebut your last point. I just completely disagree. Probably the most fundamental change in economics in the past 30 years is behavioral economics. The way economists have started thinking about how people make decisions, what type of information they have, how they process it, what goes, what type of preferences they may have. And that came about largely because when economists in the 70s and 80s turned towards game theory, other people ran experiments in labs, again, something we didn't invent but picked up from the psychologists. And lo and behold, a lot of game theoretical simple results get rejected if you have people play it in the lab. So after a while, some economists get fed up with that, and they started thinking about different models. And that's been the biggest change in economics since I've been in the profession. And a large fraction of the work today does behavioral economics, tries to incorporate those insights into more mainstream modeling and so forth. So I think this view that economics is just theory, not responsive to evidence, it's just so false.
The last word? Is that what you're saying?
Well, somebody's got to have the last word.
Okay, so one thing I agree with is that probably true that the washing machine was more important than the internet. That I have sympathy with. And look, I think the fundamental problem that I have here is the same as Steve said, which is, and I have this very often when I listen to events like today, which is that the description of the economics as I live it day to day is very different from the description that I hear from the critics. It's not this theory-obsessed, math-obsessed discipline. I mean, Steve showed you the data. It's actually, right now, it's an empirically obsessed discipline, if anything. And it's not driven by math. It's driven by observation, and it's driven by a sincere desire to explain facts that happen out there. And the math is just incidental to that process.
Thank you. Well, over to those in favour of the proposition now for their final succinct summary.
Two observations. I mean, I think that some of the examples given about, for example, the effect of rising wages on work effort. I mean, you think one thing, you think that people will work harder hours, will work longer as their wages go up, but then it was found out that there is also a leisure option in all this. Now, you don't need any modern economics or contemporary economics to understand that people actually do make these choices. John Stuart Mill realized that in 1844 without any maths whatsoever. And therefore, I see a lot of modern work as reinventing the wheel, an endless reinvention of the wheel. That's the nature of the subject, full stop. And every generation, people who haven't been doing economics for long, but just studied in the 80s, I mean, they will say, no, look, we've made terrific advances. I mean, all that stuff that was in vogue 10 or 20 years ago, that's all irrelevant now because we've got behavioral, we're now doing different types of, better types of econometric work, and therefore we advance. I think we will. This is cyclical, and we will. And so I don't accept that. Second point is, I noticed Professor Pisckhe, he used the word frictions at one time in talking about the labour market. Where does the word frictions come from? Of course, it comes from physics and engineering, and that is the model that the economists will always have. If things don't go away the way that maybe the theory will tell them they should, they will always introduce frictions, and that is exactly the mindset that I am disputing.
Thank you.
Right. Well, let me make 2 points. The proposition is that there is too much math, too little history. Huh? We are not saying that we should abolish math, we should turn economics into history. No, I'm not saying that. Yeah? No, I'm a pluralist, both in terms of theory and methodologies. Yeah? I have, never used any math in my work, but I don't say that people shouldn't do math. Yeah? I mean, people should do math. Yeah? We just need division of labor. Yeah? That's the way economics. That's where economics started, wasn't it? Yeah. The first thing that Adam Smith wrote about is division of labor. Yeah? So that's the origin of economics. Yeah. So we should practice that. Yeah. Yeah. So that some people should do math, some people should do econometrics, others do the survey, interviews, historiography, everything. Yeah. And we need all these different theories to fully understand the world. Yeah. So actually there's nothing to dispute in the proposition, yeah? Because that's only saying that, given that, we are actually doing too much math, yeah? Yeah, and I think that very few people will dispute that, because, yes, if we had 9 lifetimes, why not everyone become top-class mathematician as well as historian as well as the interviewer and so on? But we don't have enough time for that. Yeah? So that somehow
we don't have enough time for that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. One last comment. I mean, we need to think about the cost-benefit ratio that we get from this math. Yeah. I mean, are we getting enough the benefit given the cost that the students have to expend to learn all this stuff? Let's leave it at that.
Thank you. On my schedule, I'm required to deal with some voting. I'm not quite sure how, but would those who are in favour of the proposition too much maths and too little history raise their hands, and I'll count them.
Yeah, if you're in favor of the proposition, there's too much math, too little history.
But after a quick count, I think we should consider those who are against the proposition. Good at estimating.
What's your intuition?
Well, I think it was a nice clean fight, and I'm not sure the best side won, but we won't. I'll leave that to the students to make the announcement, I think. Thank you very much for coming. Thank you, speakers, for your...
So thank you again to our distinguished panel who gave up their time today to battle it out, leaving no blood on the floor, I'm very pleased to see. If you wouldn't mind just moving out of the auditorium and now taking all your stuff with you.